pediatric grand rounds. It's a beautiful Thursday, sunny afternoon. So I'm hoping we will get a few more people coming out of the sunshine to attend this talk today, because I'm really excited about the topic and the speaker today. And for those of you who were expecting Dr. Hirsch to welcome you today, he sent his regrets. He's out of the office this week. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Rebecca Smith-Bintman, who is a professor of radiology, epidemiology, and biostatics, obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive medicine, and health policy at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. She graduated from Princeton University with a degree in engineering, attended UCSF Medical School, and completed her radiology, epidemiology, and biostatistics training at UCSF. She's a clinical researcher with expertise in epidemiology, outcomes research, comparative effectiveness research, health services research, and dissemination and implementation science focused on imaging. And we're incredibly excited that she's coming to talk today to us about some of the work that she's done, focusing on the quality, utilization, accuracy, predictive values, and impact of diagnostic testing on patient health. She has engaged in a ton of research in this domain. She has NIH funding and has done a big project collecting radiation dose metrics associated with CTs over 160 hospitals in the US, Europe, and Asia, and is leading other studies looking at the risk of cancers associated with medical imaging. So she's really an expert in this area. And considering the number of imaging studies that I certainly am guilty of ordering on patients in the ICU, we thought that this was an incredibly important topic for us to learn more about. Aside from her research, she actually also is very actively involved in raising awareness of issues surrounding the need for greater safety and standards around imaging. And I imagine that our pediatric grand rounds today will be an important contributor there for at least some local awareness of these issues. Dr. Smith-Bintman, welcome. I'm gonna hand it over to you, and in the meantime, pull up your slides as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to share some of my work. As I was pulling the slides together, I realized that this is probably a talk I should have reached out to give many years ago, given the importance to pediatrics. We don't see the slide yet, but we'll see it momentarily. I am, as a disclosure, a founder of Alara Imaging. It's a company focused on collecting and reporting radiation dose information and image quality information for CT that we created in response to the need to have a way to report on quality measures that we're developing for CMS. Next slide, please. So in terms of CT scanning, it was first invented by two physicians working fairly independently in 1967, Dr. Hounsfield and Dr. Cormack, and its design was really revolutionary. The idea was simultaneously using X-rays to image large parts of the body and then using computers to reconstruct the images. They received a Nobel Prize in 1979 jointly for the work. And the adoption of CT was extremely fast. So the first patient was scanned in 1971 in London. That image shows the head scanner. You could only image the head. It was a pretty enormous machine. And the patient was in the scanner for hours, and then it took days to reconstruct the image. So it wasn't quite the same as modern CT. Within 2 years, the first scanner was installed in the US for actual clinical use. It was also just for head. In 1976, the first body scanner was installed. And by 1980, CT was widely available in the US. We were doing 3 million CTs a year. So really rapid dissemination. Currently, there are about 10,000 CTs in operation in the US and about 30,000 worldwide. Next slide, please. Although the development of CT was revolutionary, its evolution has been even greater over the last 40 years. So the engineering improvements have been rapid and have profoundly led to the expansion of the clinical applications over time. If you look at those first two images, one shows what the first images look like, really quite crude compared to the image in the middle in terms of understanding the anatomy. And then the images to the right show not just looking at anatomical areas and how they differ. So is there a bleed or a stroke, but also understanding physiology. And that's so how different areas get different blood flow in different states. And that's led to sort of an expansion of its use. It includes everything from looking at strokes, vascular disease, cancer, trauma, pain, all different kinds of lung disease, and then for screening for a lot of diseases. Next slide, please. If you get lost at where I am in my presentation, along the bottom, I have sort of the agenda. So there's really been an incredible love affair with CT, really from the very beginning. Its use in every setting where healthcare is provided, be it intensive care units, emergency room, or every outpatient setting. It also has led to the creation of an industry of radiologists willing and able to cover readings all night, every day. So it's now a 24/7 availability. And that was not the case when I started my residency. It was still something that you had to think about because of the access and the number of people who could read it. It's consistently ranked as one of the most important advances in medicine. It's really adored by patients and providers. And it's also incredibly profitable. And the profitability has led to an increase in the number of scanners and different number of specialties who own scanners and an increase in the number of scans over time. One of the major changes in CT is how quickly we could scan a patient. The technology used to basically need to be rested between patients so this machine wouldn't overheat, and that's not the case any longer. So instead of doing 5 or 10 scans a day on a scanner, we can now do 50 or 100. By 2010, the growth in CT scanning surpassed the growth in every other area of healthcare services. We beat out pharmacy, I think, in 2010. There were occasional red flags about CT imaging related to false positives or overuse or cost. And yet I'm not sure anyone really cared very much about those issues. Next slide, please. So I have a quick quiz, this question and the next. I told you CT has grown, that we use it widely. How many CTs do we use? How many scans are performed per population in adults? So is it 1 per 100 people in the US have the scan each year, 1 in 50, 1 in 25, 1 in 10, or 1 in 5? And so you guys get to vote. Before I give you the answer, I want to go to the next slide, please. So this is the same question. Oh, back to the slide. It's the same question in children. How many children are imaged with CT per year? And you see my choices have much less frequent scans. We image children much less, but nonetheless, how often do we image them? Is it 1 per 1,000, 1 per 500, 1 per 250, 1 per 100, or 1 per 50? So next slide, please. I am not sure how to get the answers to those questions. What were your answers? Cherise, do you have the answers? There we go, the questions. So in terms of how many CTs are performed in children, really the more important question in this audience, 1 in 250 was by far the most common answer, 44% of people. And then 1 in 100 was listed by 28. So basically, really good consensus about around 1 in 200 children are scanned. The answers on the slide. On the left is the answer in adults. So these are data from 2018 in the most right time period. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm showing you 2016 data. In adults, on the y-axis, they're about, in the older adults, those are older than 65 in the top line, we do about 400 CTs per 1,000 patients per year. If we go to the lower line, it's about 100 CTs per 1,000 persons per year. So overall, the number is about 220. So we image about 1 CT for every 5 adults. And if you go to the children, notice the difference in the scale. It doesn't go up to 450 per thousand, it only goes up to 40. But we image about 20 children with CT per year. So about 2%, one per 50. 5 times more frequent than most of you guessed. The line on the top shows imaging in the US. These were data collected from 7 US healthcare systems, Ontario, Canada, looking at trends in imaging we published a couple of years back in JAMA. But basically 1 in 5 kids in the US, it's 1 in 10 children in Ontario get a CT every year. So we're using this technology a lot more than most people realize. Next scan, please. So really, we were using this technology rather frequently, and yet until several occurrences happened at the same time, really no one thought very much about the possible side effects. And the change in perceptions really occurred overnight. 3 things happened at the same time, and it really led to a dramatic shift. The first is there were several media reports of radiation overdosing. These were initially reported as having occurred at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Southern California, although it was then rapidly expanded to many other institutions. Basically, patients underwent a diagnostic CT and they lost their hair in a band-like distribution in one area from the CT scan. And this was due to a really interesting, complicated detail of how the doses were higher than they should have been, but the doses were 100 times higher than they should have been. So they were in the same range as the doses we use to treat patients for brain cancer. So that was the first thing that happened. Next slide, please. What that happened is that suggested that CT machines are capable of causing harm, which we didn't really know about. The second thing that really changed perceptions overnight, it happened really in the same period of time, is there was a single child in Northern California that underwent a CT scan and the technologist irradiated him 15 times. Basically, wasn't sure the machine was working and just kept pressing the button over and over again. And that too got a lot of media attention. And third, we published a paper in the Archives of Internal Medicine on radiation doses that was in the same period of time that suggested there is high variability in the doses that we use, that you can't count on getting a standard dose. And so this suggested not only do you have harm when the machine doesn't work correctly or when the technologist is not trained, but even when scans are done routinely, there's high variation. And so it happens for routine indications that you have a problem, not just in these gross errors. Next slide, please. In terms of where this problem came from, so why are the radiation doses sort of where they are? There was great pressure from really the manufacturers, or pressure from the radiologist on the manufacturers to generate increasingly higher resolution images. The machines were capable. The machines by themselves use 500 times or 1,000 times the radiation of an X-ray. And yet there was pressure to actually increase these doses even more to get the kind of spectacularly detailed image that I'm showing you on the screen here. And manufacturers who are selling machines were competing on image quality, and these higher quality images come with a cost of greater radiation exposure. There is an increase in radiation with increased image clarity up to some point. Above that point, you don't get more clarity. And yet we were developing new techniques, radiologists were publishing on it, manufacturers were promoting it, that kept pushing us to use higher doses. Now, the technological advances that allowed these more beautiful images could have allowed us to get the same quality images, just drop the doses. But we didn't go that way because of the push and competition along getting really high resolution images. As an example, you can scan the entire body in a few seconds, and that could have led to shorter scans that we irradiated less, or to actually developing 2-phase scanning, 3-phase scanning, 4-phase scanning that allowed us to understand the blood flow during the body in different phases of the arterial cycle. And so the trade-off was, do we push image quality, or do we push safety in reducing dose? And we pushed higher quality. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to share with you basically are three areas of questioning that my research focused on, and sort of some of what we learned. And those questions are: one, what are the doses for CT? Two, are these doses a problem for our patients? And three, can we lower these doses without undermining accurate diagnosis? Obviously, we care about making diagnosis. We don't want to have patients get a scan that's useless. So all of things were incredibly important to me. I was in some ways very lucky in the timing of my first paper on radiation dose, in that it coincided with the overdoses that really led to a lot more interest and concern, be it in patient safety organizations and the government and funding organizations, that allowed me sort of to move forward to pursue more questions along these lines. Next slide, please. So the first question that I published a large number of studies on has to do with the question of what other doses for CT. And each of those studies, they've been done on increasingly large populations. So started from looking at doses at 4 hospitals in the Bay Area, then looking at doses across the 5 University of California health systems, then added a large number of pediatric hospitals. And our most recent work involves a registry that collects data from 160 hospitals, or what sort of I'm going to make my statements on, and some of the citations are below. But basically, the doses are highly variable and higher than needed for diagnosis. And that's been the result of every research project I've done. Second, there are no data that the higher doses lead to more accurate diagnosis. The variation reflects practice preferences, what doctors in a given hospital or technologists choose to do, not evidence. And literally, the strongest predictor of a patient's dose is not how old they are, their body weight, which is an important predictor of dose, or not why they're getting imaged. Are they looking for kidney stones, or are they looking for a ruptured abdominal aneurysm in a given patient? But rather, the biggest predictor of dose is where they go for imaging. And patients and most physicians are really incredibly unaware of these risks. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the doses are highly variable and higher than reported. I want to give you an example to support that. UCSF led the study that involved collecting data from 160 institutions as part of the UCSF International CT Dose Registry. The registry includes data on 11 million CT scans collected from a large number of institutions. And this figure shows one measure of dose, effective dose, for one type of scan, abdominal CT, across those different imaging facilities. So those are a whole lot of little box plots, 100 and some odd number. The colors represent the country, or the country. So the purple are hospitals in the US, the yellow are hospitals in Europe, and the purpley pink color are Israel and Japan. Each column, which are ranked by the effective dose, the light purple shows the 5th to 95th percentile of dose, the dark purple, pink, and yellow each country, and then the top of the darker color is the 25th and the 75th percentile. So if you take the yellow that's all the way to the left, it's very tiny, they have very consistent doses. That's a European study, but right next to it is a US facility. If you go all the way to right, the last box is a US facility. There are a lot of dark pinks to the right. The dark line, the horizontal line just below the 20 effective dose level, is the 75th percentile, often used as a benchmark across all the hospitals, and the dotted line shows the average. And what this graph is supposed to show is that some hospitals, almost every dose was above the 75th percentile. Others are entirely below the average, and the variation goes from an effective dose of about 3 or 4 millisievert to an effective dose of about 28 millisievert. And these are all for abdominal CT, and these are all adjusted for patient size. So it's just meant to show there's profound variation as you go from one place to another. In general, Europe is really in the lower dose, Japan and Israel quite in the higher dose category, but the US spans the entire range. Next slide, please. The next slide has just a few summary points, a little bit easier to see. This is just showing you average dose for abdominal CT by country. So the average dose from an abdominal CT scan in Switzerland is 8.3 millisieverts, with 4.4 as the standard deviation. 7% of doses would be graded as being high dose in Switzerland. And if we jump to Japan, 26 is the mean dose, so 3 times the higher average dose. And 69% of dose are judged high dose. So the variation is really profound across country. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a little bit of information about the variation in children, because what I just showed you was actually only adults. So this is showing data from a different study altogether. I'll tell you a little bit more about this up front. It's a study called Radiation Induced Cancer Study, RIC. UCSF is leading the study with a PI from UC Davis and a PI from KP Northern California, whose goal is to assess the risk of cancer associated with medical imaging. As part of that, we've pulled basically all the CT scans across the study period. So the data I'm showing here are from 33,000 exams that were retrospectively reviewed on these patients. They're sorted by the effective dose. So on the left, I'm showing you the effective dose, and on the right, I'm showing you the colon dose, which is a little more ragged because it's sorted by effective dose. So it doesn't go exactly parallel. So the mean effective dose for an abdominal CT scan in children, it's in US and Canada, adjusted for patient size, is 10 millisievert, kind of a number about twice what we report. And the colon dose is about 17 milligray. And the variation you can see is profound. And the top doses are kind of in the ballpark of 100 milligray or above and 100 millisievert. So those, I want you to think about those numbers, average of 10 to 17 and a range up to 100 when I show you a few slides up ahead. Next slide. This slide shows actually doses over time, which I think is quite striking. These are showing doses for head CT in our youngest children, not our youngest, actually less than, preemies aren't on here, but children ages 0 to 4 years. And the blue line on top shows the absorbed brain doses by year of time on the x-axis. And the average dose in 1996, when our study began, was about 80 to 90 milligray per CT. That's just remember that number, 80 to 90 milligray, and it comes down to 40 milligray in our current exams. That goes out to 2018. Could you hit the next slide for me, please? And so I just, again, want to emphasize that number. This is the average absorbed dose for a head CT in a small child in the US and Canada. Next slide, please. So I hope I've convinced you there's variation in dose. What's responsible for that variation? And so using data that we pulled from the International Dose Registry, we tried to understand what was associated with the variability. So we had detailed information on the patients, why they were undergoing scan, their age, their size. We knew what kind of scanner they were scanned on by manufacturer, the specific make and model. And we knew what facility they were imaged at. We found that radiation doses absolutely vary by all of these factors. Size is an incredibly important reason for dose variation, as it should be, but none of those factors accounted very much for the variation across institutions. The variation was almost entirely due to local decisions and protocol for scanning. And I should say, I've discussed these results with a lot of groups, including the chief medical officers for all of the large manufacturers. And they all said at the beginning, oh, well, you don't know, if they were using the machines correctly or which machine make and model, and they didn't have the capacity. And I said, well, we had that. And that actually didn't matter. It didn't matter if they had the newest or the oldest machine. It mattered how they used it. And then they all said, yes, that's what we have found as well, that they promote buying these new fancy machines, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people know how to use them in a way that leads to lower doses. Next slide, please. I wanted to make this point with a little bit more granular table. So this was included in the BMJ paper that we published the results on the variation using our registry. The data has 50 lines of data, but I'm only showing you a handful here. And these are data for what was done from pulmonary embolism CT scanning in terms of the doses and the technical parameters across different facilities on our registry. And this is a table of only people who have scanned using one machine make and model. This happens to be the Somatom Def AS scanner by Siemens. So these are all the exact same scanner. The first line shows the effective dose in the first, the second row just after the headers, that the effective dose in Switzerland for a pulmonary embolism scan was 1.7 millisievert. And if you go down to the bottom, at a facility in the US, the dose was 32.7 millisieverts. And I've highlighted in the last two rows, what did the 10% of the best protocols look like and 10% of the worst? We had many more to average. And you can see summarized the dose at the best facilities was 1.6 and the highest was 27.5. So an enormous difference. These are average doses. These are not differences by patients. Those are tenfold higher. If you go down the second column of KVP, KVP explains a lot of the differences. At the best sites, they use on average a KVP of 100, and at the higher dose sites, 120 or 119. Big difference. The MAS, that's the energy that comes out of the scanner, 113 versus 188. The pitch is how quickly the person goes through the scanner. If they go through faster, there's less dose. So 1.2 and 0.8. The scan length, how large an area is irradiated, and how many phases, whether you phase once. For pulmonary embolism scan, you should only be studying with one phase versus 3 times, which is, really unnecessary. And so what the physicians chose to do made the difference in the dose, and the differences were profound. Everyone should be imaged for a pulmonary embolism scan using the top summary on the bottom. You should have 1.6 millisieverts, not 27.5. Next slide, please. The next slide shows similar results in a slightly more understandable format. The doses are not just variable, but they're higher than needed for diagnosis. And to illustrate this, I'm showing you data from a study that was focused on kidney stones. Kidney stones in the US accounts for about 1 million emergency department visits per year. Since 1990, CT scanning has been the primary test, less primary in children, but nonetheless, more children are imaged with CT than ultrasound. And this was a 15-center randomized control trial where we randomized at the individual patient level to either get CT or ultrasound as the first test. This was a study led out of UCSF. The results have been published in several papers. What I want to highlight here is the light blue dotted line that's around 4 millisievert. It is well established that you should be doing low dose for kidney stones. Kidney stones are calcified and they're easy to see on CT, and you don't need a lot of dose. And this is one of the indications that radiologists talk a lot about, like, oh, we use low dose when it's necessary. Well, this is a case where it's necessary. This was a study of 27 plus 100 patients, and these were the doses used at all of the institutions. And again, it's showing a box plot showing the 25th, 75th percentile in the shaded and then the outliers. And 95% of patients in this study didn't get the right dose. They got a dose above the right dose. UCSF is A, so we did the best in this trial, and we didn't do very well. I'd say we did pretty poorly. And we standardized as part of this study almost every aspect of the care of these patients. And I didn't standardize CT because I didn't think it was necessary. It was obviously a huge mistake. But this is supposed to show what current practice is and how far we are from optimal. Next slide, please. So I expressed why doses have gone up, right? To improve image quality is really the reason they went up. But why are they so variable and so high now that we know that they're higher than we need and highly variable? Well, there are no comprehensive standards or guidelines for CT scanning. There are a whole bunch of recommendations that are not very detailed or specific. And a question that I get asked a lot is, what is the right dose for CT of this kind? And truly, that question is treated as if it's an esoteric question, like as if there's some open debate that we need to have about how much dose we need for a child's head CT. There is no organization responsible for collecting or reporting dose information. The only area of radiology where there is some oversight is mammography, and the FDA oversees every mammography facility in the country to ensure the doses are in line with what they should be. Nothing exists for CT scanning, even though the doses might be 100-fold higher. Technologists receive no consistent education. Radiologists determine the settings, but they don't know that much about dose and cancer. They're setting them based on how they want the images to look. And the guiding principle of a LARA, as low as reasonably accessible, advisable, allowable, is just too vague to provide any real guidance. It basically allows every radiologist and every technologist to reinterpret what should be done. And I think the absence of explicit guidelines introduces unnecessary harm. So what are those harms? Next slide, please. Are the doses, is the question, used for CT scanning harmful? CT scanning uses ionizing radiation, which is a well-known, well-studied carcinogen, cancer-causing agent. There is substantial evidence of the harmful effects of radiation. At very high levels, it leads to burns, hair loss, immediate harms. The doses we use are not typically in those ranges. They were in the cases of the radiation overdoses that got so much attention where people lost their hair. They're typically far lower than that, but they're nonetheless in the area that in the level we'd expect to see harm. It damages DNA and it increases cancer risk. I'll show you the evidence that we have for that. It's estimated that 2 to 5% of all cancers in the US come from CT scanning. So not the majority of cancers, but a significant number, particularly since we don't really have that many things to do to lower our risks. Using CT raises them. CT in 2019 will result in somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 60,000 future cancers. And so we're not talking about a small number here. There was a paper published in 2009 that estimated the number at 29,000, but the doses they used were far lower than our actually observed doses, and the number of people who underwent CT was far lower. The number of CT scans we use is currently over 90 million CT scans a year. I think what makes this area tricky to really understand for a lot of physicians, researchers, and patients is the risks are delayed. You don't get the CT cancer right away. And so by the time they're delayed, you have it overlapping all the underlying cancers in a population. And so it's easy to ignore them. But I want to share a little bit of the data that I think should suggest we should not be ignoring them. Next slide, please. So I mentioned there's a lot of data about the harmful effects of radiation. There is an incredibly vast literature that's gone on for over 100 years that have really elucidated the harms, starting from the early discovery of the X-rays and the early cancer development in the people who were exploring X-rays. And I listed here sort of basically a timeline of the studies that have been done, but it's extensive. I occasionally hear in the radiology communities that I travel in that, oh, radiation for medical imaging is so low, there's no data, we have no idea that it's harmful, it's different than all these other sources. In fact, it might even be protective, that there's hormesis, that we promote cancer healing with radiation. And if there's one message I want to emphasize in this talk is that's simply nonsense. There's no such evidence at all, not a stitch of evidence that we reduce cancers, and extensive evidence that the same doses that we use in medical imaging lead to cancer. Next slide, please. And there are two publications that I think for anyone who's interested that are worth reading, at least the executive summary of them. One in the US on the left, one on the UK on the right. The first one was published by a National Academies of Science committee on the health risks of low levels radiation, extraordinarily detailed, and it summarizes what we know about radiation and comes to the definitive conclusion that the radiation doses in the range we use in medical imaging are harmful. The second publication was published in the UK, comes to the same conclusion. Really outstanding sources of data that provide definitive evidence from epidemiologic as well as biologic studies that this radiation causes cancer. Next slide, please. And the sources come primarily from the ones listed on here, although this is not an exhaustive list. So there are 120,000 survivors from the atomic bombs, Patients treated for cancers often get secondary cancers, helps us understand the carcinogenesis of the secondary cancers. Patients treated for benign conditions, we don't use it so much now. We did a lot of this in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and we give patients cancer where we treated their fungal infections. There are large groups of patients who had repeated x-rays. A good example is young girls with scoliosis. We would do extensive x-rays of them repeatedly. Radiation workers, particularly in the nuclear power industry. There've been a number of environmental accidents, not in the US, but in Europe, that have led to a lot of understanding, and then direct studies of CT in children. All of these studies provide incredibly detailed quantitative estimates of the risk of harms. I want to just focus on two though. Next slide, please. So the study of the atomic bomb survivors is really considered the gold standard of radiation epidemiology. The fact that it happened all at once, and the fact that it gave us really precise detail, because there's been such a long period of follow-up assessment, makes it really, thank the Lord, not such an experiment that we hope to see again, but an experiment nonetheless that led us, from a research point of view, understand the doses. Next slide, please. So this figure is showing basically the radiation circles of what people got in the vicinity. At the very center, in the dark maroon colored, those are patients who were basically at the center of the bombings. Those doses were over 100 millisievert on average. Most of those patients had severe burn injuries and died of those complications. The next group of patients are patients who were not right up against the bomb center, but were in 2.5 to 10 kilometers from the explosions. Those are the patients who provide the cohort members of patients who were exposed in the lifespan study. And then the light green are patients who were considered not exposed, and those provide the control group. This population of the survivors, 120,000 people who've been followed over time, it provides the lifespan study cohort. And in that population, there have been 22,000 plus cancers diagnosed. And very, very detailed information has been done to calculate their exposures depending on where they were and their shielding. Next slide, please. So what do we know about this population after all this time? Well, the first point that I want to really emphasize is that the median dose of survivors in that range of 2 to 10 kilometers was 40 millisieverts. And I want to remind you that 40 millisieverts was the same dose that we get in children when they undergo a head CT. And the median effective dose for an abdominal CT is 10, and the organ dose is 17. So we're talking about units of measurements, either millisieverts or milligray, that are kind of the same as a level of these Hiroshima survivors. In this population, there's an increase in virtually every cancer type. Leukemia, breast, thyroid are the three largest, but there are very few cancers that aren't profoundly increased in this population of survivors. The risk climbs within 2 years of exposure and remains for a lifetime. And I say risk climbs within 2 years of exposure rather than it climbs right away, because we don't really know early on when the cancer risk starts. The population wasn't followed for the first 2 years, as one could imagine why. Children are absolutely at the greatest risk, but the risk increases in all age groups. The risks are particularly elevated above 10 millisievert, but no safe level there's no threshold that can be identified in these data. And overall in the population, about 11% of cancers in survivors are attributed to radiation exposures that they received. Next slide, please. I think the survival study are incredibly important and really have driven our understanding. But I want to point out there have been direct studies of CT scanning in children. And so the first really well done study was published out of the UK. It followed 178,000 children who underwent CT between 1985 and 2002. Cancers were diagnosed through 2008. In this population, there were 74 leukemias and 135 brain cancers, Within 10 years of CT, the doses of 30 to 50 milligray, again, kind of like the numbers we're seeing in our populations, tripled cancer rates. And at the time, we didn't have nearly as much data on dose. 10 to 20% of children receive these doses for a single scan. We're in the process of recalculating that using our new data because we think it's higher. Next slide, please. This just shows sort of the linear relationship between brain cancer and leukemia risk. They were highly significant in their study. Next slide, please. UCSF is leading a study along with UC Davis and KP Northern California called the RIC study that I showed you data on dose earlier. This study is using data from all of Ontario, Canada, and 5 US healthcare systems. We have 3.4 million children and 37 million person years of follow-up. We're looking at in utero exposures and childhood exposures from all kinds of medical imaging, including CT, but also other exams. We have 2,600 leukemias and 4,800 plus other cancers. We have very accurate assessment of organ doses for CT, accurate assessment of cancer outcomes. We've linked to a half dozen cancer registries, and we are particularly making sure to account for children with cancer susceptibility syndromes who are particularly at risk. Next slide, please. This study I wanted to cite because it really it helps, I think, people who are not as comfortable with epidemiologic studies understand the significance of these changes. This is a very small study led out of Stanford where they went 67 patients who were undergoing cardiac CT. They basically did blood samples before and after the scan and did extensive analysis to determine the biological impact, if there was any, from the CT. So they did full gene sequencing, signaling, immunohistochemistry. They looked at diverse markers of DNA damage and repair and cell death. And this was after and before a single scan. The mean exposure in this population was 30 millisievert. They don't talk in this publication about why the dose was 30 millisievert and not 8 millisievert, what it should have been, but nonetheless, after the single scan, there were significant changes and expression of everything they studied, and really threefold increase in cell death and things that regulate every process that regulates cell cycle and DNA repair were activated. Obviously, it doesn't mean that these changes persist. Some of these changes will be repaired. Nonetheless, these are pretty profound changes to see after a single CT, and these changes happened at 7 millisievert or greater. Next slide. The cancer risks, we don't know a lot about this, but the cancers are clearly not equally distributed. There's some children, adults who have cancer susceptibility syndromes that are particularly at risk. So some groups like BRCA1 and 2 carriers, it has been studied, but most groups have not been studied. And it's, I think, very sad and somewhat ironic that screening children at increased risk could cause the tumors they are trying to detect. If you think about groups like ataxia telangiectasia, you're specifically looking for abnormalities that you may be causing if you screen them with CT. And most people who have many abnormalities don't know that they do. There's an incredibly sad story of a child of a very well-known radiologist who underwent CT for very mild head trauma. Within a year of that scan, he developed a very aggressive brain tumor and subsequently died. And the child had Lee-Fraumeni syndrome, but he didn't know it. In retrospect, there was a lot of cancer on his mother's side of the family. And had they known that, the child would not obviously have gotten a CT scan. And so I think we need to either lower the doses we use for everyone, or we need to screen for syndromes if we're doing a CT scan. Next slide. I'll give you a slightly more concrete example, which is children with Down syndrome, obviously a syndrome that's very significantly associated with abnormalities in DNA repair. Children with Down syndrome are at a substantially elevated risk of leukemia, 2.8% of Down syndrome children versus 0.05%, a 50-fold increase in risk. Children with Down syndrome also are at a substantially elevated risk of receiving high radiation dose across all imaging modalities. A PhD student is publishing these right now. I don't know if these doses in these children contribute to their elevated cancer risk, but it's one of the aims of our study to further evaluate that. Next slide. So the last topic I wanted to just quickly focus on is reducing doses, which is basically, I think we've identified a problem pretty strongly, but can we do anything to fix this problem? The US population's exposure to ionizing radiation has doubled in the last 20 years due to imaging. So I think we really need to do something about this. And while many tests use radiation, CT scanning is the lion's share of the contributor. And there are only two ways to reduce doses that I can understand. Either we do fewer tests, which I think is a very good way to approach reducing doses, or we use lower doses per scan. Next slide. Several years ago, I contributed to a paper to look at doses in children. These were looking at data from KP Washington. And as part of that, we assessed who got tests in children under age 15. We then looked at the doses that those children got on those exams. At the time, 10% of those children received a dose that the UK study showed tripled their risk of cancer. And using that, we modeled what national imaging in children with CT does in terms of cancer. And we estimated in 2010 that that would result in 4870 cancers, so nearly 5,000 cancers. And that if just the highest outlier doses were reduced, to reduce the outliers to the median, that would reduce 44% of those cancers, or 2,000 cancers. So the impact could be substantial, not by only eliminating CT, but just doing the same CTs in a safer way. Next slide, please. UCSF led a randomized trial using collaborators in our registry to see if we could lower doses. So 100 imaging facilities participated in the randomized trial. We looked at the impact of giving physicians feedback on their doses and combined that feedback with education and sharing best practices, basically a way for radiologists to work together and learn what the other groups were doing. The number of patients in our cohort was a little over 1 million who received high doses, was reduced 50%, depends on the body area and the measure we used. The average doses reduced by up to 40%, the variation by up to 40%. And physicians were happy, satisfied with image quality during all periods. Next slide, please. So we found, doing lots of surveys, that it wasn't rocket science what led to practices in lower doses. So any institution that tracked any measure of patient safety had lower doses. If they had standardized processes in place to make it easy to optimize doses, doses were lower. If they had organized teams focused on CT, doses were lower. If they set explicit and specific targets for doses, they were lower. And if they had leadership committed to lowering dose, they were lower. Next slide, please. I wanted to share just a moment about my experience of focusing on a radiation safety issue. A natural audience for quality research might be professional societies, but the field has not always welcomed my work in this area and the increased scrutiny that came along with my research. And being seen as a change agent was not seen as beneficial to radiology, particularly as sometimes I was advocating that we image less, which means we'd have less income. And that made making change from within radiology challenging. There were obstacles that were placed both locally and nationally on my research. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to just make a plug for what you need to do in this setting, because my experience is not unique. Researchers often make observations that are not popular or wanted and are suppressed. So it's really important to just focus on doing good science, get as many collaborators on board as possible. There's strength in numbers. Don't be afraid to speak truth to power, and find ways that you can have your research be impactful. And this may take you beyond your research in sort of our scientist safety zone. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just give you 2 slides about how I sort of managed to push ahead without going sort of through my professional societies. So radiation safety, I thought, it could be framed as a health policy issue. The exposure to unnecessary radiation exposes patients to harm. Clinical practice groups have conflicting goals and incentives. The industry has similar conflicts. Imaging is $100 billion a year business, and patients, and mostly physicians, because the physicians are the ones who can influence this, don't know much about the risks. There's a model for government oversight of radiation safety in Europe. There is a precedent for government oversight in the US for mammography, and it seemed there could be interest in this issue outside of radiology. Next slide, please. So there are lots of avenues for influencing healthcare and healthcare policy. I researched and identified those groups that could potentially be helpful, be they Congress through staff and legislators, through the FDA, through quality organizations like the NQF, payers like CMS, industry, IOM, and so forth. Next slide, please. So I don't have time to get into these relationships, but I had relationships and ongoing relationships with each of these entities to move quality and safety forward. Next slide, please. I'll give you one example. One way to influence policy is through regulation, and CMS is moving towards pushing payers to and physicians to get paid for quality, not for quantity. And they're doing so by incentivizing high quality, basically to pay for performance. And Dr. CTQs, defining and rewarding quality and safety, is a contract with being developed with CMS to create a quality measure for radiology. And the argument that I made is to improve the performance of CT, physicians need to monitor the doses that they deliver for every patient and compare them to standards. Knowing the right dose should not be an esoteric question. And with a fabulous team of collaborators, we've been contracted by CMS to draft a quality measure for incorporation into physician payment program and to develop an approach that physicians can report using this measure. The goal is to incentivize physicians to ensure the safety of every CT they do. And hopefully, stay tuned, the measure is on target to be rolled out and to judge every CT done in the country by 2023. Next slide, please. So my last slide, how to improve the safety of imaging. I think a multifaceted approach is needed. Professional societies absolutely need to stand up, and I would argue the pediatric societies really are a voice that we could hear more on this subject about. But the complexity of issues involved and conflicting motivations also support more wide-ranging approaches to change belief and practices, including oversight and changing incentives. And my hope is that our work can contribute to meaningful improvements in the quality of care as reflected in the safer use and performance of CT scan. Next slide. So I really appreciate your attention, and I think there probably should be a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. There is indeed some time for questions. This was such a great presentation, very thought-provoking, and certainly I will think a lot more about ordering my next CT scan or allowing it to happen.
Thank you.
And I'm actually wondering, there's a few questions on the chat, but maybe I can start with one asked question is that you sometimes reference to other imaging modalities. And one of the things that has always struck me in a lot of our ICUs, at least in the Children's Hospital, we have this somewhat odd practice in my mind, but hard to change, to get daily x-rays on children who are intubated on a ventilator. And I've oftentimes wondered, like, what really changed between yesterday and today? Should we find other ways to make sure that the endotracheal tube is still in the position that we wanted it to have? But maybe the doses there are so low that we don't have to worry about it. But now I'm starting to think maybe we should.
So it's a great question, and a very close collaborator who's my co-PI on our risk of cancer study is specifically looking at children, preemies, who are hanging out for months in the intensive care unit. And the amount of radiation per scan is relatively modest, but they don't get one scan. They get a scan every day, sometimes 5 times a day, as you're struggling with how do we get whatever we're moving around aligned. There's a new push in the medical physicist community, one that I very strongly disagree with, to not use shielding. And The major rationale for that is sometimes shielding is done incorrectly and we block what we want to look at. And so the solution, instead of, well, don't do shielding poorly, instead is don't do shielding at all. And so that means that your chest x-ray becomes a babygram every day on your little tiny fetuses. And I don't have time to go into it, but those fetuses have those preemies, we do fetal estimates of radiation as well, but the preemies have a lot of bone marrow in all of their body. And the absorbed doses, because they're so little, are tremendous, absolutely tremendous. And so you want to make sure that the doses are as low as they can possibly be, right? You're looking for a line. You don't care what anything else looks like. You want to make sure that you're reminding the radiologist how much you care that this dose be really, really, really low. And if they tell you about hormesis, you say, thanks, not we're going to go with the National Academies of Sciences and say that radiation is harmful. We're going to try to minimize this. So get those to be as low as you can, do as few as you can, understanding if they have benefit, that's great. If they don't have benefit and you're doing it on protocol, that's not great. And the one other issue that sort of you have a lot of ability to impact is how that information is reported in the patient's medical record. One of the questions is what should be reported. And in our, not plain films, I'm jumping to CT and fluoroscopy, we report measures in the medical record in units that comply with state law, that you have to put it in the medical record, but do so in a way that is incredibly complicated and you can't understand at all. It's reported in CT-DI-VOL and DLP, they're units. I work with these units a lot, and every time I work with them, I move them into effective dose so I can understand them. You know, what effective dose is a measurement of a DLP of 1,000? I have to translate it to get comfortable. No one understands that. And the degree that you sort of ask radiology, can you put these measurements in effective dose so that we can understand it and explain it to our patients? Not that that's so easy to understand, but it's easier because effective dose is the measurement that we understand what we get from our exposure just from living. We get exposure, putting it into a unit that we can compare it makes it a lot easier to understand.
I think that answered a little bit the questions that are coming up in the Q&A about whether people have access to the radiation doses. So especially, and patients will have too, because we now have an open record. Let me just screen through a few more questions.
I see. I can see the questions now.
Oh,
for
good,
some
good.
reason.
Do you want to pick which ones you want to answer? Because we only have a couple more minutes. But
absolutely. And thank people who wrote in for their kind numbers. I think in terms of liability, there is no liability whatsoever because there are no rules about what doses are allowable. It's okay if you go above them. So the patients who got the radiation doses that were instead of 2 milligray or 20 milligray or 200 milligray for fancy CT, a perfusion scan, the doses were 2,000 and 20,000 milligray. So the doses were 20 gray. These are the amounts you give from 10 radiation treatments. And the hospitals could still argue, we didn't break any rules. Those doses were acceptable, like crazy, and which is why I'm pushing that we need measurements and that we have to have them. And so I would say we're going to be submitting our measures to CMS in May. Anyone who would be interested in helping us organize the pediatric community to support these measures that say you should look at your doses and judge them, I would love you to reach out to me and figure out how to get their support, because the radiology community may not be excited about being measured. In terms of where the burdens distributed, most of the cancers will occur in children who don't have a risk factor. The children who have cancer susceptibility syndromes are at far greater risk, but they still are a minority as far as we know of those impacted. I think one of the questions said, might it help require knowledge about radiation dose and late effects as part of the recertification exams for radiologists? I mean, clearly I'm not a person in a position to make or influence that decision, right? This is, I think I think leadership in radiology has often been afraid that bringing awareness to this might lead patients to not want imaging. And so there really has not been a full-hearted embrace of this issue within radiology. Um, so I think we love the amazing images that I showed you, which, I have a graphic artistic background. It's partly why I went into radiology. I love the images. Um, but we're not using them for diagnosis purposes that we know are more diagnostic than lower doses. We're using them because they're really, we're enamored by them. And I think that's something that has to change. I think the last question is that are there algorithms that are calculated the ideal dose for efficacy and size? And that's some of the work that Alara, the company that we created, is hoping to do. Their goal is to basically provide feedback to every hospital on these are your doses that are going to fail the CMS measure and cost you money. And if you change them to this, you'll get the bonus instead of the penalty, sort of to incentivize them to do the right thing.
Well, I thank you again so much. I'm already receiving email and messages from people how important this is, and I'm going to make sure that the link to your talk is widely distributed to all of our trainees and physicians because it's so important. I also got a message from one of my colleagues that says, this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to work on, so you should get an email from my colleague. You have already at least one partner in crime in the pediatrics department. Again, thank you so very much to everyone who's still on. I know it's after 1 o'clock, so thank you so much for sticking around. And thanks again. We probably will get you back sometime because I think we need to know more about this. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated the chance.